First off, thank you for attending. I know it's the last session or time slot of the day, so we appreciate you all selecting our session to attend. Today, we're going to talk about IT system integrations with ArcGIS Location Platform and how you can use Location Platform to enable, geoenable your other IT systems with the location services that come packaged with ArcGIS Location Platform. As always, we appreciate your feedback, so we do ask that at the end of the session, you do provide feedback so that way, it helps us enhance it for the next time, if there is a next time, we do this session again. As for introductions, my name's Nico Loza. I'm a solution engineer on our commercial sector team. I work a lot with our developer tools as well as our enterprise analytics and mapping systems. So, and I'll pass it over to Russell.
I'm Russell Sands. I'm also a solution engineer on our commercial sector team. I primarily work with our users in the technology sector, and oftentimes they're the ones who are developing or building the systems that we're going to talk about today.
Perfect. So to begin, sort of a quick agenda. When it comes to integrations between enterprise systems and applications, it can definitely take many forms, right? And each of those forms having various degrees of complexity. So when approaching an integration during the design process, it's important to consider, what types of integrations may be possible. So for example, an external system may include REST APIs. It may submit data to a database and provide Python-based SDK access for querying. But these details provide different approaches to the integration, which may be better suited for different workflows or requirements to your system. So for today in this session, we're going to focus on a couple of different things. So the ArcGIS system integration in its totality, as well as a high-level way to achieve such an integration, as well as the different approaches that can be possible when integrating ArcGIS location platform in specific to an external business system. We'll then get into common use cases that we see in the field with various types of integrations, and then we'll give a demonstration on what a sample integration could look like. And then at the end, we'll go ahead and wrap things up with some documentation and where you all can go to make sure you hit the ground running when approaching an integration project. Perfect. So the first thing we want to do is when talking about ArcGIS and its ability to integrate with other IT systems, we want to make sure we define the meaning of an IT system. So when thinking about it, think of it as a collection of computing and or communication components, as well as other resources that support one or more functional objectives of an organization, right? It helps you manage your proprietary data to achieve the main characteristics of data quality, and those characteristics being accuracy, completeness, reliability, relevance, and timeliness. So, of course, there are different items at work within an IT system, right? And this is to streamline your organization's operations. Items such as servers, databases, perhaps a GIS, a customer relationship management system to pair client account information with location awareness, right? Or any other software, enterprise software, like ServiceNow or Salesforce. But as we all know, data can live in many different places, but bringing it together in tandem with the analytics enhances workflows and the insights gained from the data and the proprietary data that's stored inside of those disparate IT systems. So integrations with ArcGIS platform places an organization a step or many steps closer to achieving those 5 data quality characteristics that I had mentioned. And so what we're going to focus primarily on is the software piece of an IT system and how ArcGIS integrations enriches day-to-day interactions with an organization's IT system. So now that we've defined a IT system, the next thing we want to do is transition from that common IT system to something that we always like our users to be aware of, and that's the ArcGIS system, right? So that way we can then place these two together and understand how they can operate. So the ArcGIS system comprises of many different components that range from a SaaS solution with ArcGIS Online, where you have the ability to host your data, analyze it, share it out to others. A local software solution like ArcGIS Pro for your heavy GIS users who are looking to run deeper analytics, create 3D models, run some statistical analysis. You then have your server software coming in the form of ArcGIS Enterprise that's deployed on your infrastructure behind your firewall and can be either in the cloud or on premise. But where we will be focusing primarily for this session is the bottom piece, which you see is ArcGIS Location Platform, which is our PaaS solution. And this allows developers who are looking to bring those same tools and services that power our internal use software, to be exposed to their proprietary application, whether it be internal or external. ArcGIS Location Platform is the true developer experience in the ArcGIS system by giving them access to our client APIs for both web and native application development. It supports open source libraries like Esri Leaflet, Mapbox.jl.js, and it also allows you to most importantly, allows you to bring in our location services, our state-of-the-art location services like geocoding, routing, places, base maps, and so forth. And with ArcGIS Location Platform, it is a consumption-based model, so you only pay for what you use. And the authentication comes in the forms of either API keys or OAuth credentials to allow developers to be met where they need to be met. Now that we've defined the IT system as well as the ArcGIS system and where we'll be focusing on, when thinking about pairing these two systems together, you may think, where can you go to get a good notion of beginning an integration, right? And as you see in today, within the plenary, there's a host of different resources that we provide, but most importantly, in our ArcGIS Architecture Center site, where you can get where it speaks high level of what's included when knocking down those siloed systems and what it looks like, how it looks like to integrate these separate systems and have them work in tandem with one another. So we know that a component of an IT system almost never works, or the components of an IT system almost never work independently of one another. So connecting a hosted database like in SQL Server or in a Postgres database, right, to an analytics component of your IT system, and then determining who has access to those results with an identity-based management system allows your organization to, again, operate seamlessly and ultimately achieve those functional objectives when deploying an IT system. And so because of this, right, we want to make sure that our users who are approaching an integration project hit the ground running, which is why we get into detail of what's included with our integration pillar of the ArcGIS architecture. And so to dive a little deeper in that integration pillar of our ArcGIS Architecture Center, we break it down into 3 different tiers. And so the first tier being the presentation tier or application integration. This tier is focused on user interaction. So integration at the presentation tier will differ based on the chosen user application. So whether it's web, mobile, desktop. And this processes that are included in this tier typically require, lightweight workloads that are responsive, to users within a few seconds. And something that, we'll hear a lot about today. The next tier is that service level integration. And this is also known as the application tier. So it's very services oriented. It's also and it's where data is processed and processes are orchestrated, right? So system to system interactions occur in this tier, and the workloads are in that medium weight context. It also includes contextual content as well as business logic that's injected into it. So coordinated, that again are coordinated between the applications and the data. Requests in this tier are expected to be responsive in the time span between seconds to minutes. And this can be, or an example of this could be something like a territory or work assignment within that system integration. The last tier being the data level integration, also known as the data tier. Is where data is managed and stored, right? So you have your authoritative data stores, databases, file shares, and data pipelines for your processes for ingestion, ETLing, transformation, enrichment. And these processes can be formed across multiple systems, right? So it's common that they are scripted processes to automate them. And the digital and to have that content ETL'd between the systems. In the data tier, processes typically can take between minutes to hours to complete. And an example of this is doing something like geocoding an entire database to standardize the information that's being stored to then present to your users. Perfect. And again, just touching on the overall ArcGIS system, and where we're going to be focusing on in our presentation is going to be that bottom piece, so location platform, our PaaS service. Now, when looking at the ArcGIS system in its totality, so that last slide we just saw, there are some questions that may come across the mind when approaching a system integration, such as who are the intended end users, or who are the intended users? Who manages the infrastructure? What is included? How are content and services secured? And what are the options for developers? So those some answers, as you see here on the screen, may overlap in some of the columns that we see. So in location platform, online, and enterprise, there are some differences to be cognizant of when considering what type of integration you're looking to pursue. But most importantly, when focusing on location platform, you can see that it's targeted at developers when it comes to the end user, right? When it comes to managing the infrastructure, it's a hosted Esri solution. So you simply call the services, and we manage the infrastructure behind the scenes. You can see that when it comes to what's included, again, it includes our state-of-the-art location services like base maps, geocoding, routing, and so forth. When it comes to how our content and service is secured, as I mentioned, right, the authentication methods are in the form of API keys, OAuths, and then even being able to add refer restrictions to, again, add that level of security. And additionally, when it comes to, when it comes to what are the options for developers, you can see that it's a common set of APIs and SDKs. So no matter which column you're in, especially when it comes to location platform, your developers have access to either our branded Esri SDKs for JavaScript, Kotlin, Swift, and so forth, or for open source developers in the form of Esri Leaflet, MapLibre, OpenLayers, and then even having your automation, your scripting and automation tools like our Python APIs. And so many of these attributes make it a lower hanging option for system integrators. And especially with that authentication avenue being a big piece, especially for the cases when you want to do one or a batch call to these services, right? These are ideal, right? No need to worry about named user credentials. And with location platform, you can keep your system's usage separate from your other ArcGIS deployments, whether it's online or enterprise. Perfect. And to talk a little more about integration approaches, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Russell.
We will try very carefully not to trip on the wiring there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some different integration approaches. I'll just confirm, Johnny, can you hear me all the way back there? Great. I won't dive too much into this slide because I just end up repeating myself in the next few minutes here. But one of the things that I like to do when thinking of different approaches to integrating, whether it's an application, services, or data, are sort of four general categories that we'll get into. You know, we have event-based access to service, embedding whole applications that are either configurable or maybe you've built them. You can develop or extend components in other systems, or really bite off the full chunk of it and build something from the ground up. When we're thinking about event-based access to services, this is something where if you imagine you have a user who's in another business system, and when they're interacting with it, they need to retrieve back something from our ArcGIS location platform. So a really common example of this might be, I've created a new record in System X, and what I want to do is call the same geocoding service that I use in my GIS so that when I then analyze those things later, I get that same answer back. And so one of the things that you can do is use, and the tool might vary system to system, but different methods for creating flows or REST APIs, triggering these things, webhooks, right, to call a location service when a change happens in another system. Something else that you can do is actually embed an application that you might already have into this other business system that you're being asked to interact with. And I'm going to use the word iframe, and people sometimes react to that strongly, but you can actually take that approach pretty far. And one of the things that you may notice if you've worked with Esri's configurable applications is that a lot of our applications have parameters, query strings that you can add to the end of that URL. And as a developer, you can take that approach and use it in the applications that you yourself are building. And so you could create an app that accepts a parameter for the address that it should zoom to, that it accepts something, the category of the product from the other system. So that when the page loads in your other system, you pass that down into the iframe, and you actually get something that can respond in some ways to what the user is doing. This is a really basic example here. It's an app, and it uses calcite, and it is a table. But it doesn't have anything in it. Because what this app is expecting is to receive a URL that has a latitude and a longitude and the list of geo-enrichment variables that you want to receive. If it gets that, it knows how to handle that response and put those rows into the table. And so this is something that you could craft and embed into another system. And as long as you have access to information when that page loads, you can cause it to react and feel like a really tight integration to that end user. But there are limits to that, and one of the limits of an iframed approach is that you don't end up being able to talk back and forth, or at least you can't talk back and forth very readily without calling a service behind the scenes. Luckily, most other systems that we see organizations adopting have some extensibility framework, and oftentimes they allow you to develop your own custom components that can that system better. Like Esri. Oh gosh, there we go. Like Esri has calcite. Many of the other vendors that you'll encounter, whether it's Salesforce or ServiceNow, Microsoft has Fluent too, right? They have design systems that they use that enable you to build a component that looks and feels like the other system you're writing it for. So while you'll hear a lot about calcite here, and calcite is a great design system for to use when you're building ArcGIS applications for ArcGIS users, if you're building a component for someone in another system, always recommend checking out like what is available to me there, and can I make my app feel the way that my users expect it to? The button is the color they expect it to be. And of course, the last thing that you can do as an approach to integrating different systems is to actually build an entirely custom application. We have obviously many partners who have done this, where they've built browser-based mobile desktop applications that integrate between different business systems. We have lots of users who have done this. It's also should go without saying that this is like the highest effort approach that you could take. So certainly in the way that we've discussed it, I'm really trying to go from, what is relatively straightforward, geocode a record when something happens, to now I'm here building an entire application from the ground up. And in just a minute, we're going to get into a demonstration and show a little bit of this. But first, Nico is going to walk us through just a couple of common use cases that we see when we're talking to users.
Perfect. So as Russell had mentioned, when it comes to those different approaches with integrations, some of the common use cases that get tied to those approaches are ones that you see here, right? So simply being able to geocode records that are within, your third-party database or so forth. Geo-enabling forms to ensure that the standardization of the data that's coming in is there, as well as assigning work, something in like a work order management system, and also being able to simply enrich records with demographic variables and attributes that come from a geo-enrichment service, and how the demographics around something like an account can look when going into something like a CRM. On the geocoding, on the common use case of, those geocoding records piece, right? Some typical scenarios are ones like geocoding all records in an existing system. And again, to standardize the data so you're meeting that, that reliability piece of data quality, right? It's reliable and it's consistent, and having the ability to persist these locations for future analytics. So storing them inside of your system. And additionally, as new records come in, making sure that those records are then following that standardized process of the addresses that get pushed in. So making sure that geocoding those records against our service that can then be, again, persisted for future analytics. And when it comes to some examples of this, right, using something like a connector within Power Automate to geocode something like a Salesforce record, so whether it gets created or an existing record that currently exists. On the side of geo-enabling forms, some typical scenarios that we see are ones like providing a type ahead search suggestion. So as the user inputs an address, right, what are some sample or suggestions that can be given to make sure that we're reducing the possibility of any user error. Auto-completing forms based off of address matches in a geographic location, right? How other fields in a form get populated as a user selects that suggestion, as well as providing users with a list of valid options based on their location, right? And so we can see this as, a form gets filled out, right? And an address begins to type. We can see that drop-down box of suggested addresses using our suggest API. And then as that address gets selected, how does that then relate to the following records within that form, right? It gets pre-populated. On the side of assigning work, the common use case of assigning work, some typical scenarios that we see is, being able to assign that work based on territories, and also service areas to find the nearest service agent. So as a work order gets submitted, right, making sure that that work is being addressed as soon as possible by the nearest agent, as opposed to somebody who's possibly 2 hours away from that work order that was submitted, when it can be assigned to somebody who's perhaps 15 minutes away. And even ordering and assigning tasks using something like the routing service, right, to find the closest facility. And then on the common use case of enriching records, right, as I mentioned, displaying demographics or even market potential data from the geo-enrichment service alongside an account or lead to get a good understanding of where they're located, what does a demographic climate look like around them, and then what are some possible accounts that we can target based off of the demographics around them. And to exemplify one of these common use cases, I'll pass it back to Russell, who's going to walk us through a demonstration of an integration.
For which I will remain seated here. And actually, before I switch to my screen, I have a confession to make, and I need to actually apologize to everyone that's from. So you may have noticed in the description of this session, it said there will be no maps. And that's because that's actually like my personal goal as an Esri employee, is to give a session at every conference where I don't show any maps. And unfortunately, I'm going to break that promise I made you in the description. And there's a good reason, though. So one of the things that we talk about when we're talking to users about developing an integration to another system, a key recommendation that I would make is always consider what's available to you in that system first before you crack anything open and write any code. And so the demonstration that we want to show is how we can use enrichment data and location services to add additional insight to an account page in Salesforce. But Salesforce actually does have an existing way of interacting with ArcGIS content. So if you want to not see any maps, you need to close your eyes for just a few minutes, and I will let you know when the maps are gone. Otherwise, this is your warning, I'm sharing my screen now, and we're gonna see a map pretty much right away. If I knew which computer I was on. That was your last chance to close your eyes. Okay, so this is Salesforce Maps. This is a application that Salesforce offers through Sales Cloud, and it allows a user to understand the data that they store in Salesforce through the context of a map. And it actually has a lot of capabilities. So I could change the base map, I can connect to content from the living atlas, change the depth of the map, view live weather, traffic information, and perhaps critically, I can come in here and turn on anything that I have in Salesforce that has location information. And so it's going to process my records, and I can come in here and see a handful of accounts that I have in San Francisco. And I can also connect to additional data. So if I want to understand the area around these locations in more detail, I can come in and I can connect quickly to some data that's coming from ArcGIS Online. And you can see it's changed my base map, and it's taking all of the styles that I have. I can come in here and turn this customer heat map off, and I could look at a different view of it. So anything that you can do, or maps that you can create in ArcGIS Online, or even location platform, could potentially be consumed here in Salesforce Maps. But what I'm not able to do, and this gets to, we're going to exhaust our option here, is what this doesn't let me do is put this data sort of directly on an account. There are some capabilities in here that I could use to click on a record, if they call it click to create, which would actually allow me to attach some of that. But maybe I don't want to go through that manual process in order to do it. So what we've done is create a Lightning Web component. And if I pull up an account record here, we'll look at the Grateful Heads Pillow Company. What's happening behind the scenes is we're actually reaching out to the enrichment service, and we've got a number of results that have come back for 15, 30, and 45-minute driving time around this location. And this is being pulled dynamically from the enrichment service. So if I were to switch to a different account, I would get different data back. So as a salesperson, I can start to understand more about the market that's around this account that I'm trying to visit. Maybe I'm trying to place my product on their stores. This is actually relatively straightforward to create. And what we're doing here is using our enrichment service and Lightning Web components. So I'd like to show you a little bit about how we actually built this and some ways that we could improve it. What I'll show you first is actually the component library here. So you're probably familiar with Calcite. Like Esri has Calcite, Salesforce has the Salesforce Lightning Web components and the Salesforce Lightning Design System. And so I can come in here and find different kinds of components that I want to use. In my example here, I'm using a tab set. So if I come in here and search for tab, I can see this tab set, and I can get examples for how to actually start using this in my application. Now, what I've done here is create this Lightning Web component, and I'll show you a bit about how that works. When you're creating a Lightning Web component, you're always going to create 3 files at a minimum. You have an HTML file that defines what the component should look like, some JavaScript that describes how it should interact with data, and a metadata file that essentially tells me where should this app show up inside of Salesforce. My template is relatively straightforward, and it's using some of the design tokens from Salesforce. And so, oops, I've lost my mouse. What I can see here is I can use the actual styles that are coming from Salesforce. And so if these things changed in the future, the branding change that was associated with that, this would automatically pick up those updates. So I have a tab set, and it has a bunch of tabs within it. What I'm using to create each of those elements for the drive times is something that Salesforce Lightning Web Components call a directive, which gives me the ability to put a for each statement directly inside of my HTML. So I can say for each tab detail, and we'll see how we get that in a moment, add a tab and give it a label. And if you've written with other frameworks before, you might be familiar that when you iterate through something, usually you need to put some kind of key on it. And that's true in Lightning Web Components as well. And then I populate that tab with another directive because I have a whole list of results that have come back from my enrichment service. Getting that information is actually fairly straightforward if you've ever worked with the enrichment service before. There are some things that are particular to this component that I'll talk about. We're using some capabilities that Salesforce Lightning Web Components make available to me. First, I'm decorating some of my properties with this API, and that just means that they're available to receive data. And so, for example, I use the API to get the record ID, and this is going to be changed anytime the page loads. That's pretty important because I can use this wire service to receive data from Salesforce, and I'll come down a bit here. Just jump to the bottom. So every time record ID changes, which is what this little $sign indicates inside of a Lightning Web component, I'm going to go and get some tab details using the latitude and longitude of the record that has been brought on. And so that means that every time this page loads, that's how I'm able to get and change the context that I'm seeing in the application. Now, the rest of this is relatively straightforward, interacting with the enrichment service and parsing the results that came back. One of the key things that we have to do is actually take that latitude and longitude coordinate and create a study area. And if you want to learn more about that, the documentation for the enrichment service has a lot of information about all of the ways that we could actually tweak this, the ways that we could change the study areas or the analysis variables to get additional information. But if I were to go back here and look at my component, there are some things that aren't super great. One is probably the alignment. I zoomed my screen in here and it made things wonky, and I could do better as a developer probably. But the other thing is that this is just a number and it's not formatted in a useful way. Now, I could go and figure that out on my own and write the code to format that, or maybe use some of the built-in capabilities of JavaScript. But it's another thing that Salesforce has the ability to do for me. So there's also a component for formatting a number. And helpfully, I can do things like do decimal formatting, or I could do currency formatting. And the enrichment service also tells me in its metadata when I get a response back, what kind of data have I received? Is it a count, a ratio, currency? So I can use that. So let's go ahead and I'll show you another thing that we can do here. So I have this enrichment results component. I also have a component called formatted enrichment result. Very clever. And what this component does is it takes the results value and some information about the format style and passes it to this Lightning formatted number. And my other component can actually call this custom component that I've written. So I'm going to comment out my spans here. And the one thing that I would mention as I do this is that when you name your component, it's in camel case. But when I use it, I say it's a custom component and it's going to be in this kebab case here. So it's the same name. So it's formatted, enrichment. Now it does want some information from me. So I can come back here and look at the API and I see it expects the result. I have that up here. So we'll just copy it so that I can't make any typos. And as long as I've done this right, I can publish this back to my org. This was the risk where I actually have to type something and get everything correct. And if I come back to my page and reload this, these should, fingers crossed, all be formatted correctly when the response comes back. Another thing I could have done would put a little loader icon on there. But you can see that now my enrichment results component is invoking my formatted component, so I can sort of make these atomic and repurpose them. If I want to change the data that's in here, I might think that I could come in here and just edit this page. But the way that this component's working now, if I just select it, it doesn't give me any configuration options. It's another thing that's actually relatively straightforward. So I'm going to come into this metadata file. Like I said, the metadata file is telling me information about whether this should show up and where it should show up in the configuration. I can also define some properties. So if I want to expose properties that would allow someone who's using this component to set the buffer radii, change the travel mode, set some default values that it should use, I can do that. And to make all of that work, I also have to expose them by decorating these with API. So I'll just copy that a few times. And we can get rid of these values that I set. So what's going to happen when I publish this is when I refresh that page to configure, I'll actually be able now to define what this should look like inside of Salesforce. So now I could start repurposing that. Maybe I add it to that page again with different data, or to a different page where I want a slightly different perspective on it. So I'll come back here, refresh this Lightning App Builder, select my component, and now I have some options here inside of Salesforce to do additional configuration. So Nico told me I should really do 60 minutes here, and you'll actually see this preview update as I change these things. I could change the aggregations, or I could put different variables on here. One thing that's really helpful if you're starting with a geo-enrichment service but haven't used it before is we have this analysis variable finder. It's in the documentation. And I could search for a variable by name, so I could search for dogs and see what data we have about dogs. Household owns 1 dog, household owns 2 dogs. Or I could come in here and explore this by category. Maybe I'll just grab 3 of these. I can copy them to a comma-separated. That just gives me a comma-separated string. And if I come back to my configuration, I can just paste that in. And that's going to change the results that come back. So once I hit save, reload my page. Oops, got to go back to my page. We'll see there will be different data and different radius. And so what we're really hoping to show here, and again, I should have practiced this on a little bit zoomed in, but what we're really hoping to show here is that there's a lot of capabilities that other systems tend to expose to you that you can take advantage of. And one thing to think about is that this Lightning Web Component is really a client to the geo-enrichment service. It reaches out to it, sends the API key, and receives some data. But then I'm taking advantage of all of the capabilities that Salesforce has exposed to developers to make that experience feel like it just belongs here. I'm using what's available to me in this system rather than trying to start from scratch. And that can be a little bit of a journey to go on, right? Because it does sometimes require learning some new things. How does that system give me access to its data? Sure, maybe there's a REST API, but is there something that they actually recommend doing? So hopefully this has been a useful example of creating a component inside another system and invoking it on a record page here. I'm going to let Nico wrap us up.
Perfect. So as we wrap up, a couple of things to keep in mind as if you or your organization are attempting to begin an integration project is, of course, these 5 questions that we have here on the screen. So who is the intended user? Who manages the infrastructure? What's included? How are content and services secured? And what are the options for developers? Because as we said, that though some of these answers overlap with the avenue of integration that you're looking to implement, you'll see that with these different avenues, developers have access to those common set of SDKs and APIs, right? So if they're building a web application, integrating with web application or a mobile or desktop application, right? Developers have options to apply these different integration approaches based off of the type of app that's being built. So as we wrap up, a variety of resources that are available to you all comes in the form of our architecture site that we saw a lot in the plenary here, and I'm sure in other sessions. And most importantly, the integration pillar of our architecture center site. So how we define integration, the different resources and options that are available to you all. And of course, when it comes to system integration examples, there is a GitHub repo that Russell and another one of our colleagues maintain that's open for you all to peruse through and sort of get some inspiration. And so with that, as we conclude our session, as always, we please ask that you do share your feedback on this session, right, to help us enhance it, take in that feedback and further develop. Also, we ask that you connect with us on social, so X, YouTube, GitHub, and so forth. And with that, we want to thank you all for attending this session. And yeah, any questions? And if there are any questions, feel free. You can say them out loud, or if you don't feel comfortable enough, you can come up to us and we can talk individually. Yes.
Two most common questions we receive in Germany are, first of all, what are best practices to define some request quotas? For instance, some of our platform engineering customers are using the forward proxy because it's not natively supported. And secondly, this last release of ArcGIS location platform, rotating API keys. Mm-hmm. We have some best practices, especially if it's a 24/7 running system.
Yes. I think we can speak more to the second question than the first one. I think the first question is probably a good question to go to the on the expo floor and maybe talk to the team there. When it comes to rotating API keys, there is a great session about that. That was at least one time today, and I can check and see if that's on the schedule. But some best practices, things that I would think of, and I'm sure we've thought of these things too. And so for the question is, what are some best practices for rotating API keys? And for those who maybe weren't aware or aren't using ArcGIS Location Platform today, when you create an API key, there's a maximum lifespan of that key of 1 year. And you can do some things like create a secondary key with a different expiration date. One of the things that we recommend as a good practice is just because you can create a key and forget about it for a year doesn't mean that you should. So we actually really would recommend rotating that key more frequently than that. There are some programmatic ways that you can do through REST.js to check the status of which of the primary or secondary key is active, and then activate the one that expires later, invalidate the old one, and generate the secondary. So there are some things you can do programmatically on the server side to manage those credentials. The other thing that I would consider is Location Platform also supports application authentication. And so if you have the ability to use a server-side process to generate the credential, you could actually use the application authentication pattern, so the client credentials flow in OAuth, to generate the credential that way. So your application would reach back and say, hey, you already know who I am. Can I have a token for ArcGIS? And you would send them a token and then refresh that token as needed.
Okay, but then I'm restricted to internal use only.
With ArcGIS Location Platform, you can create an application credential and there's no restriction on the use of that. Yeah, it would be or I should say the same restrictions on those services as though they were an API key. The distinction about internal versus external use is more about whether it's an ArcGIS Location Platform subscription or an ArcGIS online subscription or enterprise.
I'm thinking about because some of our startups are using ArcGIS Location Platform and deploy some API services to API marketplaces, and maybe if I'm the platform owner, I don't want to put credentials into it and bake it into a marketplace offering, but maybe I would prefer always the API key because it's not so insecure. Maybe.
I think we could definitely have follow-on conversation about it, but generally speaking, if it's something where you don't want to send any credential at all to the client, then I would recommend the application authentication pattern, or you can do something similar with an API key and sort of request an API key and just rotate a key programmatically as well. Yeah, absolutely.
No other questions?
John, any questions? Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Well, again, we thank you all for, actually, yeah.
So I didn't see in your demo when you were showing the code, where did you guys store your API key for your integration?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we would recommend doing is the way I did it maybe wasn't how I'd recommend doing it in practice. In mine, it's in a settings.json file that just exports the credential. But because you have access to Salesforce, right, and it's running inside there, you could use something like store it securely within Salesforce and then have an Apex class that does it. We did a demonstration previously where we used ServiceNow, and we used their method for storing API keys and accessing them that way. So it's another thing that I would sort of look at the other system and look into how it recommends managing or storing a credential if you have to. Yeah.
Great question.
Okay, well, we won't hold everyone any longer than we have to. Thank you so much for being here. Again, one last time, please fill out the survey form. We greatly appreciate it.